also was logged in as a host.
Okay.
So
we got the hosting covered.
yeah.
Okay, and it's recording. It didn't give me an option of where to record it.
It's recording to wherever they have it set to.
Okay.
The local computer.
Local or cloud, I don't know.
Yeah.
One of them.
Yeah.
We'll record somewhere.
We'll try to find it.
Yeah.
One minute in the
Sure.
one less person's.
Okay.
Yeah, we can.
Okay. Are you going to introduce me?
Do it.
Are you going to introduce me?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, is that?
All right, everyone, we're at 12:05, so we're going to get started. My name is Jessica Farmer. I'm Associate Director of Office of Postdoc Affairs, and we have our AVPR.
It's good to see everyone.
Dr. Jessica Mullenberg. We have Jessicas everywhere.
Yeah.
And Nathan White, he's in our office, and we also have Joy. And we know that this grant workshop is very useful. So we're trying to do it twice a year. So we're very grateful to Jake Moss. He is Director of Office of Strategic Research Development. So that office is also in the Office of Research with us. And Rachel is here also from his office. So we are very grateful when Jake comes and conducts these workshops. So just a little housekeeping, your lunch over here. And if you don't have a name tag, they're down here. And if you didn't get the email about having your 5 copies of either your specific aims or your abstract, or your project summary, and you can email it to opa@uga.edu, and we can get that printed for you real quick. The bathrooms, you can go out this door here, and men's room on this side, ladies' room on the other side. Water, drinks during the time if you need to get up and grab anything. Not missing anything. People on the Zoom, if you can hear us, can you just maybe put in the chat that you can hear? And we do ask on the Zoom to keep muted unless you need to unmute to ask a question. So good to go. That I'll have Jake come up and give the workshop.
All right. Hello, everyone. So if you do have questions, they might be answered at some point in the presentation. So feel free to type them into the chat, and Rachel will monitor them. And if it's a good interruption question, we'll do that. And if not, we'll address them at the end. I did add a bunch to this presentation, and so I'm going to try not to go over. But it occurred to me that I didn't sort of have the basics of grant writing part of it. And the last time I did this in the fall, how many people attended the one in October, if anyone? Okay, good. So, because some of this will be a retread for some of you, but that's perfect. Yeah, that's great. Okay, so I'm Jake. I direct the Office of Strategic Research Development. Just a word on what our office does. So we were put together in order to get more large, complex proposals funded at UGA. And that's the bulk of our work, is working on big multi-investigator center and institute proposals. We also work on some single investigator proposals under some circumstances, but really we can't help all faculty. And right now we're only 2 people. We are fully staffed for 3. So we can't really help work one-on-one with postdocs either. So that's why we want to do these group setting, outreach, grantsmanship workshops to give you some scaffolding for your grant writing. And with me is Rachel, who's, I mentioned, other person in the office. All right, so here's the agenda presentation. We're already well into the 50-minute block, so we'll see how that goes, Q&A. And we're going to break into writing groups of 4. Possibly there will be a group of 3. And we're going to do a workshop your specific aims pages, abstract summaries, whatever you got, your free-verse exploration of the changes in mitochondria and mice, whatever, in front of you. I should give a disclaimer, which is that I have hip bursitis and I'm on a lot of steroids, which is making me very energetic but kind of dumb. So if you ask me a question and I just stare at you blankly for a few minutes and a few seconds, and Rachel doesn't jump in and rescue me, just try to rephrase it like you would if I were a hyperactive 12-year-old, and I'll do my best to answer you. Okay, so 10 steps to success, and divided these into 3 groups. This is going to be a opportunity agnostic workshop because you're all probably working on different types of proposals for different agencies, or maybe you don't really have an agency targeted at all yet, especially those of you who aren't in the workshop and are just watching the presentation. So we're not really going to talk about specific postdoc opportunities, but I'm happy to answer questions about those. So finding the right opportunity and then researching the program. And we're going to go into each of these steps in a little more detail. Making a detailed plan, take advantage of the grant expertise that's available to you. Engage readers, people who are willing to read your proposal well in advance of the deadline. Write to your audience. So do the research that you can do about who the audience for your proposal is likely to be, what their disciplinary expertise and the extent of it is likely to be. Get feedback from your readers. Revise according to that feedback, submit, and then, because most proposals are rejected, resubmit. So you, depending on the agency and the type of proposal, you may have to revise and resubmit several times in order to get funded. You have to try to think about that as part of the process and not take it too much to heart, but we'll get more into that. So how do you determine the fit of your proposal for a specific opportunity? Well, it's a Venn diagram between what your research agenda is, what you want to accomplish, what the sponsor's mission is, and how they have distilled that mission into the solicitation requirements. And then the overlap of that is where you have common ground, where you have shared goals. So determining, obviously, you want that centerpiece to be as big as possible. If it gets too small, it's not a good fit and it's not worth your time to apply. So we're going to see this diagram a couple more times in this opening part. So finding the right opportunity, these are the resources available to you. Colleagues are really probably the best source in your immediate department because they're going to know what the funding picture is, especially those who are very research active and actively applying for extramural funding. The Postdoc Association listserv. We have a subscription to Pivot that is university-wide. Has anyone used Pivot? Does everyone know what Pivot is? Okay, so if not, Google Pivot UTA Libraries, and you can sign up. And it's a great resource for finding grants. It searches for all of the federal and private foundation opportunities. So especially if your research is a little niche, that's a good way to find sources. One nice thing you can do with it is you can set up a search and have it just email you once a week with anything new that's appeared for that in the past week. So that's a really handy and passive way of looking for grant funding. And you can say, I'm looking for grant funding. And this is one case where you couldn't say, I'm actively looking for grant funding. I'm passively looking for grant funding. Sorry, that's kind of a grant writing joke. People love to say actively, and often it doesn't mean anything. Yes, you're doing something. That's a verb, so it's active. Anyway, so grants.gov is, of course, the federal repository of all grant and contract, well, not contract opportunities, but cooperative agreements. Foundation Relations, we have an Office of Foundation Relations that does kind of a similar thing that we do, but with foundations and not so much the federal government. So that I didn't update this to add, we have something called the Foundation Directory, which is actually a historical record of all foundation grant opportunities, but it's very helpful for seeing what foundations have funded, so you can see if a foundation might be interested in your particular scope of work of your project. Office of Research has 2 newsletters. One is Research Insights. The other one is a weekly limited submissions and large grants email. If you're not subscribed to those, you can sign up for Research Insights on the Office of Research webpage somehow. And if you want to sign up for large grants and limited submissions, Rachel can sign you up. I think that's what we're doing now, right?
Yeah, there's officially a link, but it's hard to find.
Great.
So email me.
And then if you're in, is anyone in arts and humanities? So Wilson Center for Arts and Humanities also exists and also has some overlap with what they do. So if you're specifically a humanist or an artist, that's kind of your first stop if you're looking for grants, because that's their sole focus. And there aren't that many opportunities. So it's very easy for them to cover all the opportunities that are available. So researching the program. So close reading. This is, of course, I was an English major, English grad student. Close reading the solicitation, really trying to figure out what the intent is behind issuing this specific solicitation rather than just accepting proposals on a wide variety of topics. There's an agenda there and you need to figure out what it is. So again, you can write to that sweet spot in the Venn diagram. Explore all the hyperlinks. So NSF in particularly loves to reference workshops they've done, fact-finding conversations that they've had among scientists. And if you can demonstrate demonstrate that you have looked at that material and you understand that's what went into the creation of the solicitation, that can be a little differentiator for you in your proposal. Read about the sponsor and their mission, find whatever info there is on awards that have been made in the past. And so incidentally, I don't think I have this on there, but finding proposals, getting proposals, whether it's from a mentor or a colleague, or just someone you know that have previously been submitted to a solicitation is, of course, very valuable. And people are generally happy to share. You can ask us if something has been funded, if we have funded proposals in a particular to a particular program, and especially if it's kind of a weird one. And we'll look and see if we have anyone and let you know who has got those awards so that you can contact them. Get advice from your colleagues, develop an abstract one-page or elevator pitch. That, of course, is what we're talking about today. And then contact the sponsor. So this is written generically. At federal agencies, being a program officer at a federal agency involves being willing to talk to people who are proposing before they submit a proposal. That's part of their job, although sometimes they don't act like it. But if you can talk to the sponsor beforehand, once you have a well-developed idea, figure out what questions you have. That's an important step. And often when people ask us a very specific question about a solicitation, we say, contact the program officer. So you might as well be planning on doing that. So you've done your research. The question now is, how good is the fit? Should we actually go ahead and write a proposal? So once again, you're considering, now that you know more, you've done all this research, where do you stand in that middle area of the Venn diagram? Make a detailed plan. So we have, this is a rather involved timeline and checklist. We have generic versions of these available on our website that you can start from. So basically, this purpose of this is, a proposal is not just the narrative. It is a whole bunch of other parts, facilities and equipment, biographical sketch, current and pending, mentoring plans, all that kind of stuff. So the purpose of this is to map out on a timeline what your plan is for developing the proposal so that you don't leave anything to the last minute or forget that you have to do it. And then suddenly you need to talk to somebody who's out of the country before, and then your proposal is in jeopardy. So building it, you build it by revisiting the solicitation and making sure that you've listed all the things that are required by the solicitation, but most solicitations will also refer you to a generic grants guide. So those are your two sources for developing this. For NSF, it's the PAPPG, the Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide. NIH has, I don't know what they call it. No, that used to be called the SF424 guide. I think it's just called the grants.gov guide now or something. But that's the sort of basis for all of the required elements. So you need to look at both of those to build this. And you're staggering the deadlines. So part of that, as you can see, any given week, it's not completely overwhelming. You have a discrete series of tasks to do that week or things to work on. And actually the first few chunks there are 2-week increments. But you'll see this also goes out 3 months. That's a pretty standard and workable timeline for a single investigator proposal. If you are doing it in less time than that, it's going to be more of a crunch. Obviously, if you have, it also depends on how much time you have available to spend on it. So you can adjust this as necessary, but it is helpful in mapping out what you have to do. Okay. So taking advantage of grant expertise, senior colleagues, peer colleagues, The grant staff, if you're in a college or school, they're likely to have a grant coordinator or a DLSA who can help you with questions about grants and how to maybe able to help you develop some portions of those, like the budget, help you with the dreaded science CV biosketch and current and pending situation that's happening. And then program officers, like I said, the default answer to a question is, well, ask the PO. Recruiting readers. And so this is important consideration for what we're doing today, because really you do want to have 3 different types of readers for your proposal. You want obviously to have subject matter experts who are people who can understand your science and critique your hypotheses, critique your methodology and your approach, get into the nitty gritty and make sure that you are, there's nothing in your proposal that would offend a reader, a reviewer who had a lot of expertise in the field. Make sure that you're not missing extremely important precedential literature that you need to grapple with in order to carve out a space for your proposal. But then you also want colleagues who are scientists but who are not in your field, because there are going to be people who border on that in most study sections, most review panels. There will be people who are not experts in your subfield, maybe might even be from a related field, and you want your proposal to be reasonably understandable by them. So that's kind of what we have here, is people who are obviously in different fields, but who are all scientists, and so should be able to understand your proposal, especially at the abstract or summary level. And if they can't, that's one of the things we're workshopping. So how can you be clearer about what your research is, what its significance is, what the innovation is, what the impact is. And then finally, lay readers, because science ultimately has to be understandable by the general public. At least, in order for it to be science, it has to be communicated. It can't just exist in a vacuum. So having lay readers can really help you understand how jargony your jargon is, and whether you need to unpack some difficult terms, which is almost always the case, because you're so familiar with it. You've spent years and years packing that suitcase of that word full of information and understanding what that means. But then when someone goes to unpack it, it's just a black box. That's a mixed metaphor. All right, so writing to your audience. So gather as much information as you can about who your reviewers are. And NIH publishes the rosters of their study sections, so you know exactly who's reviewing your proposal. If you have time and inclination, you can deep dive into each of those reviewers, especially the ones who are doing very similar work to yours, because you know they're going to be looking at your proposal and thinking, well, but this little nitpicky point. And so you have to sort of consider that possibility. It'll also tell you how far afield some of the reviewers are from your field. So how do you make sure that you're reaching those people? Are they a homogeneous or heterogeneous group? So if you apply to foundations, sometimes they can be extremely heterogeneous. There might be a couple scientists and then doctors and lawyers and bankers. So to what extent do you have to pitch your proposal in a way that is totally understandable by just a rank layperson? As a rank layperson myself, I can say that. It might be insulting to others. So this is the timeline again. This is the timeline specifically for the narrative portion. And these are just terms that I use, and you may have a different writing process than this, but generally starting with an outline from the solicitation. So if the solicitation has a lot of text that is saying you have to have these sections have to say this, you have to address this here, the best thing to do is make it outlined. Just paste that solicitation into a Word document and delete all the unnecessary stuff and make yourself an outline so you make sure that you're focused on what the agency wants you to focus on throughout the writing process. I left out 2 weeks for outside review, so you've engaged your readers earlier on, and then you have 2 weeks where you're not focused at all on the narrative, which is always a relief, and that allows you to work on some of the ancillary documents that we talked about. Right to the overlap. So now you have a pretty good idea of what they want, what your project is. the goal now is to convince them that this, to put it one way, the overlap in the Venn diagram is bigger than it actually is. So convince them that indeed fits right into their mission. It's going to be feasible. You have the capacity to carry it out, and it's going to result in the sort of outcomes and impacts that they're looking for. Sending draft to readers. Different readers will have different levels of understanding and be looking at your proposal in a different way. So I already sort of addressed this. Subject matter experts, nitty gritty, colleagues outside your field about the logic, clarity. That's actually where jargon comes in. And I've found in previous workshops, there's a lot of discussion about, well, what does this mean? This means something different in my field, which is helpful just in general, but then also can help you to refine your language to make sure that you're limiting the amount of misunderstanding that could occur during actual review. And then lay readers, at the very least, they should be able to understand why you're researching this problem, why this is a problem that needs solving, and what the potential impact would be if the proposal is successful. So a lay reader should be able to understand those things. And if you're not communicating that, that's actually kind of the best person to be able to give you feedback, like, what is this study actually going to produce in terms of real world impact? And this note at the bottom. So you want to have your draft in an advanced enough state that you have solved all the problems that you can, and you've written all the stuff you can. And then, because you don't want people to be like, well, you don't have this in there, and be like, well, yeah, I know I don't have that. I'm going to work on that. So try to get it to a state where they're not going to tell you issues that you're already aware of. So again, this is an idealized version of everything where the blue is completed and the red is not completed. So again, at this point, you're working on the ancillary documents. So revision, don't blindly accept every change that someone asks you to make. This is actually sort of good practice for when you get reviews from the agency and you are working on a resubmission. Ask clarifying questions so that comments that you don't understand. People might be, depending on the person, you might talk to them. If it's your spouse, for example, or significant other, you might be seeing them often. If you can say, what do you mean by that? And they'll be like, I'm trying to make dinner, stop talking to me. So rewrite back to front. For some people, the writing process is a thinking process. So as you're writing, you're thinking through what you want to say, and you get to the end and you really kind of nailed it down. But don't stop there. Take what you've done at the end. And sometimes you go back to the beginning and you're like, oh, I was just sort of spinning my wheels trying to figure out what I was doing here. You don't want that to be the final product. So make sure when you're rewriting that you bring your full understanding of what you're doing to bear on all the parts of the proposal. So that's what I mean by that. When you need to cut, inevitably your proposal will be too long. When you need to cut, usually you need to cut methods and approach. And that's because you're not going to have enough room to convince reviewers beyond the shadow of a doubt that your project is going to be successful. So there's a point where you're providing all this information about your methodology and approach, but you reach a point of diminishing returns where you've given them a lot of information and more information is only going to help a tiny little bit. So what's more, and everyone who is applying, well, the majority of people have solid science that makes sense, that has a good rationale and all of that. So where the differentiator occurs is your ability to explain what the significance is, why what you're doing is novel, why it's going to be a leap forward rather than making incremental progress, and what the potential outcomes and impact are going to be. And the more you can tie those into the mission of the agency and the purpose of the solicitation, the better off you'll be in terms of the review of your proposal. And then proofread, yes, and proofread again, obviously. And if you have someone who's good at proofreading in your life, it's always better for someone else to review your writing than to go through it yourself, because your brain accepts what's there sort of uncritically as you're rereading and rewriting. But very important. And this is sort of the mechanical part, just in case anyone doesn't know this. You are not authorized to submit a proposal on behalf of the University of Georgia. There are people whose job that is. They're in sponsored projects administration, or they may be in your unit. There are people who have what is called designated limited signature authority, who are people who are authorized to submit, who aren't in the central office, but have been delegated to be able to submit proposals. So you may or may not know who that person is yet, but you can figure out who it is. And make sure to contact them as soon as you know that you're definitely going to submit a proposal. It doesn't have to be months in advance, but certainly they would want it weeks in advance. They want to know weeks in advance so that they can be scheduling their work, because often these people are submitting, 200 proposals a year. And sometimes, especially around those NIH deadlines, there's just a glut of proposals. Yes, we're going to go into that. Kathy Cuppet is my spouse, and she is in charge of Sponsor Project Pre-Award, and she demands that I put this in here in every presentation. Do not wait until the day the proposal is due. There can be power outages, internet outages, fire, flood, pandemic, computer crashes, snow and ice storms at the agency or university, and hurricanes. All of those have happened. And sometimes you can get what NSF calls an anthropogenic exception, but sometimes you cannot. So plan ahead. Especially now, I think that it's getting harder to get those. The agencies are have become a lot more strict in terms of what they will accept. So, and then hope for success, but embrace rejection. And that's a terrible thing to say, because nobody can really embrace rejection, but that's what we're striving for, because it's part of the process. Because what you really want on your first submission of your first proposal, or your first submission to a new agency, or in general, is to get good reviews. And by good reviews, I don't mean reviews that will make it fundable, but reviews that will provide you constructive feedback and actionable suggestions for how to make the proposal better. And so the better your first proposal is, the better your first narrative is, the more reviewers are going to be likely to want to read it and engage with it and improve it. So that's the level of quality we're going for. A proposal that gets really constructive reviews, I would consider it a success, even if it's a rejection, because as long as it's a program that allows you to resubmit. Because resubmission is great, because you've done most of the work, and now it's just a matter of synthesizing the reviewers, grappling with the reviewers' comments, sort of synthesizing what they have to say, and deciding how to respond or whether to respond. So this is an example of a resubmission chart. It's pretty simple, and this is just a sampling. This is a much longer document. Usually it's 5 or 6 pages, because there are a lot of comments from reviewers. And so what you do is just chart out the critiques in this left column, and then work through them and figure out whether you need to respond and how you need to respond. And basically, there are a few different categories of responses. There's a question of, the fundamental question is whether, first of all, whether their critique is valid, and whether it's likely to recur in a future study section or review panel. And then if it is valid, then how are you going to address it? Is it something substantive that you need to do a bunch of work to address, or is it a matter of increasing the clarity of your proposal? And often it's the latter, and that's the easiest thing to address. And we will, I don't know if we've had a case where a postdoc has come to us with a resubmission, but I think that we have a policy of helping anyone with a resubmission, just because it's a nice low leverage point for us, because again, you've done all the work, and we can help you with this chart. And then you can also use this as a guide after your revision to see whether you have adequately addressed all of the comments according to the plan of how you're going to do that. I'd like to draw your attention to the response. Majdi respectfully disagrees. No need to address this. So he's decided this guy's just wrong, or this reviewer is just wrong. And that's well within his rights. He's not going to enter into an argument about this in the proposal, because it would be a distraction for anyone else who didn't think that was wrong. And that's the tricky part of rewriting a proposal, is you can end up addressing a weird stray comment from one reviewer in an initial review that no one else would have thought of, except that you have raised it in the revision of the proposal. And so now that thing is there and might draw attention, that be like, yeah, hey, that is a problem that they would not have even noticed in the first place. So there's a little bit of strategy to how much to address something and what to address. Anyway. All right. Any questions about any of that? That's the first half of the presentation. Yes.
I just saw in the last slide that, for example, they were considering to include some post surveys, but there's no budget for this. How do you handle these kind of situations where?
Yeah. So, I mean, so what you do is find an economical way to administer a survey. And obviously we have survey software. I forget what's the new one called, Rachel?
Question Pro.
Question Pro. You're on the hook. I can remember. So, and we do have people on campus who can help you design surveys. If it's education related, the Center for Teaching and Learning. If it is, you know, something more general, there's a survey and evaluation group within Carl Vinson who might be able to help. So yes, and it's going to depend on what the expectations are in terms of measuring outcomes that the agency has. So what is their expectation? So they need to show that they've invested their money in a product that's going to be delivered. And so the extent to which you want to make sure that every activity that you're proposing has a clear outcome and that there's a way of measuring that outcome. And so in the case of whatever this was, right, so they were doing workshops and student tours. So all they were doing was counting participants. So in that case, the pre and post survey might just be when they register for the workshop, they send them a little survey about how much you know about this, and then do a post survey as they exit, and then some of them. So that's like not that much of a, if it's something that's more involved, then you do have to make some budget for it. And that's expected in a lot of types of proposals, especially your bigger NSF proposals will actually require you to have an evaluator who's doing that work. So other questions?
I have one in the Zoom chat.
Yes.
So they're asking, can postdocs be PIs, or do they need a faculty member to be the PI, and then they're listed as co?
Okay. So there are certain opportunities. If this opportunity is specifically says it is for postdocs, you can be PI, no questions asked. If it does not, then there is a permission process. So either you, sorry, lost that train of thought. So if you have a, give me a second. This is what I warned you about. So the question is it appropriate for you to be PI on the project? And that's going to be partly determined by whether you have, in some cases, whether you have control over a lab space. So in cases where you don't have sort of the kind of access, the kind of resources that you would need, then it makes more sense for a faculty member to be PI and for you, of course, actually run the show and do all the work, right? If the project isn't of that nature, then you can, there's a permission, there's a form that has to be signed by your department head, I think, and then you can be PI. That's okay.
Are there differences in terms of whether the postdoc is international or local?
Only in terms of whether you're, yes, so some, let's see. Do you know the answer to citizenship questions?
I feel like it depends largely on the opportunity. So like some will explicitly say you have to be a US citizen or permanent resident. And then others will, I feel like foundations are more likely to be like allowing anyone.
Yeah.
Whereas like federal often it's only citizens or permanent residents or non-citizen nationals. Yeah.
Just adding to that, recently we submitted a grant to USDA, and I had an idea to submit it. It was so in sync with my dissertation. I wanted to apply for the postdoctoral fellow, but I couldn't because as I'm not a citizen of you have to be at least a permanent resident in order to be as a PA on certain grants which are sponsored by USDA.
Okay.
So my current PA served as the PA, and I'm like the co-PA.
Okay. Yeah, so it will be agency or solicitation specific, and ultimately, if it's not clear, you ask the program officer. So, okay, we have to blast forward. So I have to mention, we're recording this. The recording will be available, and all these slides will be available. So All those of you who are furiously taking pictures, you can stop. So our learning objectives here, we finally get to those after the first part. Understand the purpose and nature of each of the nearly universal components of a research grant project summary specific aims page. Learn how to use that summary aims page as a roadmap to the project description or research strategy, and practice analyzing and improving your colleagues' summary aims and your own. Let me project this. So general grant writing, these are my just general grant writing tips. Remember that you're arguing that the sponsor should give you money. This is not a discursive form of writing, it's an argumentative form of writing. It's every sentence should serve a purpose. It's not the place to ruminate or philosophize or to talk about how interesting something is. It may very well be interesting, and that's going to be present in the way you describe it. Don't tell a reviewer that something is interesting, important, or unique, because that will put their hair up, their hackles up. You want to show them that it's interesting and important and unique just by your very well-written and mellifluous description of your research. So show, don't tell. It's always good advice. Signpost. So a couple different forms of that term. One is simply a sort of mechanical way of making sure that your sections are labeled and clear, so that when you go through the proposal in that rewriting process and you're talking about something that you haven't talked about for 7 pages, you can refer the reader back to where you first talked about it, or where you want to mention it early on in the proposal, but you don't have room to talk about it early on, then you can say this is further discussed in section blah, blah, blah below. So that's a very sort of just roadmap-y way to signpost. The other form of signposting is to keep reminding the readers about why you're talking about a specific thing. So you get your way into this detail, you have paragraph after paragraph of methodology, and some of your readers, especially those who are not subject matter experts, may have a hard time figuring out why all this information is important. So periodically, in a natural way, hopefully, you want to remind them of why you're doing this particular experiment, how it's going to feed into the other aims that you're trying to accomplish, that sort of thing. Think like a reviewer, know your audience, we've covered that. Try to anticipate counter arguments. That's a great thing that outside readers can do for you, is to argue with you. So you can, practice, figure out how to address those before reviewers have them. Understand the reviewer's apples and oranges problem. And I talked about this a little, but if a panel has 10 proposals that are all equally scientifically meritorious, in terms of experimental design, feasibility, your capacity to carry out the research, how do they make the decision? But they can only fund 5. How are they going to select those 5? And the answer is significance, innovation, impact. If NIH, if you have a disease that affects 30 people, it's less likely to get funded than one that affects 30 million people. In general, there are certain parts of NIH that are devoted to rare diseases, and often there are foundations that do rare diseases. So knowing that, it behooves you to spend a little more time on thinking about what the potential impacts are, both by the end of your research, and then how is your research going to contribute to the advancement of the field, or to what NSF calls specific desirable societal outcomes. Actually, I'm not sure they use that language anymore, but it's in there. It's statutory language, so they have to. And then identify and emphasize your differentiators. So figure out what it is that makes your expertise unique, whether it's a facility you have access to, whether it is the intellectual environment that you have access to, whether it's specific experience that you've had in the past. And those are good things to emphasize, because you're both saying this is why no one else could perform this particular research. I'm the only person who could do it. And those are usually more memorable sort of things for reviewers. So it tends to make your proposal stick in their minds a little better. So try to follow, where you can, this hourglass structure. And this is the structure of the 5-paragraph essay that I'm told is still being taught in schools. So this works both at a holistic level for the proposal, and at the level of a section or even a paragraph. So starting with a topic sentence that's clear. Sometimes you can overdo that, but it's better to overdo it than underdo it, because that's another form of signposting. Say, now we're talking about this. What is this paragraph or section about? How does it flow logically from the last paragraph? Provide any background that the reader needs to understand the details that are about to come. And then you get into the details. Then you're pulling back out. So how is this a logical step in a sequence of activities? And then how is it related to the project's goals, outcome, or impact? It's pretty much impossible to do all the time at a paragraph level, especially when you're in methodology. You're not going to keep pulling out to say, and this will, benefit millions of cancer patients. You can't keep saying that. But when you have the opportunity to pull back out and signpost for the reader why this is important, I feel like I'm repeating myself here, but it's very important. All right, so 15 minutes for anatomy of a research proposal. This is sort of takes a specific aims page as its assumed template, but this is pretty universal among pretty much any federal agency and most foundations. This is actually adapted from a very good webpage that the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases NIAID has on their website for how to write a proposal, which I recommend. And so we're going to get into detail about what each of these things is. So I'm not going to go through this here, but you'll have this for reference later. Actually, we'll go through them. All right, so the hook, captive viewers' interest. Background, this is what we were talking about, leading readers from what they know to what they don't know. The rationale is how your activities you propose will lead to the results you seek. In other words, what is the logic for why you chose this way to address this problem? Identifying a gap in knowledge is sort of the sine qua non of any research proposal. There has to be a gap you're filling, otherwise what are you doing? There has to be a critical need to fill that gap. It can't be sort of you're not doing it for fun. Explaining how this fits into a long-term goal, providing objectives. Of course, you have either a hypothesis or research questions, depending on the nature of your inquiry. And then some of these are a little more optional than others, but usually there is an element of innovation. How will this move the field forward? You need to outline what the expected outcomes will be. And then you need to demonstrate, and often this is demonstrated through ancillary documents more than in the project description itself or research strategy, but demonstrate that you have the capacity and the qualifications to carry out the research, that it's feasible. And then impact. So impact is important. How will this research change the world? Okay, or how will it have concrete good outcomes for society? This is just a breakdown of the difference of sort of where you find these elements in a specific aims page versus an NSF project summary. And USDA is pretty similar to NSF, and these aren't really wildly different, but some of this stuff is in a bit of a different order. So this is something to come back to later on. All right, so here's an example. I'm kind of familiar with this now because I've used it so many times, but it's more or less gibberish to me in terms of what the science they're actually producing. But I can still sort of understand, it's so well written that I can understand what the impact, significance, innovation are in the proposal. So we're just going to talk through it. So the hook, the transcription factor FOXP3 is critical to the regulation of numerous debilitating human immune-mediated diseases, the prevalence of which together affect over 8.5 million people. It's a pretty good hook. It establishes how widespread the problem is, and thus sort of speaks the potential impact of successful research. In inflammatory bowel disease, chronic intestinal inflammation indicates aberrant in vivo FOXP3 plus T regulatory Treg cell function. Similarly, pro-inflammatory signals in vitro impaired Treg function. Clearly background that we need to know. Our lab was the first to characterize the essential role for the histone methyltransferase, HMT, EZH2 in the epigenetic regulation of FOXP3. Recent published work extended our observations, indicating a key role for EZH2 in FOXP3 repressor function. So I've identified that as being part of the rationale for the work. It also shows the capacity of the lab because they were first to characterize. They're clearly on the cutting edge of this field. However, this is often the turn to the gap in knowledge. However, The regulation and biological impact of the FOXP3 EZH2 pathway to IBD is unknown. So that's the gap in knowledge. This knowledge, they just go ahead and use the word, is important given the apparent loss of Treg cells and inflammation. So that's the critical need. Long-term goal, notice how these are labeled and in styled text. There's no prohibition against that. It's very helpful for reviewers. Just lay out what these things are. The next part, our long-term goal is to dissect epigenetic mechanisms regulating Treg cellular differentiation function, particularly in the setting of GI inflammatory diseases, as these discoveries will facilitate design of human cell therapy trials for IBD. So there's the impact. And notice it's not like at the end necessarily, but it's right woven into it can be wherever it makes sense for it to go. Consequently, the objective is to characterize the role of the epigenetic regulator EZH2 in Treg suppressive function, Treg suppressive function. So then there's more rationale. They're supported by preliminary data, demonstrating all these things. Based upon these compelling data, we propose a central hypothesis that EZH2, which is bolded in all caps, plays a critical role in the homeostasis of Treg cells and the disruption of EZH2 function by inflammatory signaling pathways contributes to IBD. Our rationale, explicitly stated, they probably could have italicized that. That would have been one of my edits, is that identification of mechanisms to restore Treg suppressive function in the setting of intestinal inflammation will offer new therapeutic opportunities within the field of IBD, and that's also impact, but I just left it as rationale. I think maybe two things. So then specific aims, they list exactly what they're doing. Notice how short these aims are, and they are supported kind of uniquely by this graphic, which is you don't often see in specific aims. There's no rule against it. Of course, the rule is if it is more helpful for understanding the space that it takes up would be if you wrote in prose, then by all means, go ahead and put in a good graphic. I'm not sure I understand this at all, but I don't need to. So, but the aims themselves are very short. They're not going into a lot of methodological detail. They're just explaining what they're going to do. And the expectation is that those aims obviously will be greatly expanded upon in the research strategy. So you're not going to be able to explain everything about each one of them. You just want to give them an idea of what the aims are going to be. Upon conclusion, so this is outcome, we will understand the role for EZH2 and Treg loss of function in the setting of active inflammation. So there's your deliverable. It's just a scientific deliverable. This is an NIH proposal, so it doesn't specifically have, you don't have to talk about broader impacts, but this is nevertheless a broader impact. So understanding that role is going to lead to facilitate design of human cell therapy trials for IBD. So that outcome will lead to that impact. And this discovery will stimulate new areas for experimental therapeutics of human chronic inflammatory diseases. That's again impact. And then the sentence at the end addresses sort of capacity and the availability of facilities. So our environment makes us uniquely qualified, this thing's over it, given the extensive experience of histone-methyltransferase, really like the word methyltransferase, biology, pro-inflammatory signaling, and FOX3 gene regulation. Personally, I would have moved this sentence somewhere else in here and ended with that pink one, because that was ending on impact. But, you know, it got funded, so who might argue? So, any questions about that? Obviously, not all of this is black and white. A thing can be two things. Something is both background and rationale. Often, for example, impact and outcomes are sometimes a little bit blurry where those lines are. Outcomes being things that will happen immediately at the end, and then impact being more long-term. So what impact will this have on the field or on, in the case of NIH, human health? By the way, the way that people most often, at UGA at least, get rejected by NIH is not making a clear enough case for how their animal research is going to benefit human health. That's probably the number one reason. Just because we are who we are, we're not a human clinical research university, although we're moving in that direction. So even though NIH is our biggest funder, the biggest recipient of NIH funding is VetMed, of course. So it's all animals. So keep that in mind. You have to make a good case for impact on human health. That was an aside. All right. So this is, I probably could have done this way instead of reading through it, the whole thing. But this is, so here we have the slides that are specifically, so this is the hook. Capture the reviewer's interest, get them excited. Sometimes you can't come up with a really catchy hook, and that's fine. In that case, just straightforwardly say what this proposal is doing, and that's totally fine. But if you can, if you can make the case, this is going to affect 8.3 million people, this is the specific problem that needs to be addressed in order to unlock research that will benefit all these people, then by all means, hook it up. Here are some examples. Flooding is the most frequent and costly natural disaster in America, with more than 850 billion in damages and more than 5,000 deaths since 2016, representing 2/3 of the cost from all natural disasters. That's a pretty good hook. So clearly research is significant, both the human cost and the financial cost. Nematode worms are abundant and ubiquitous in marine sediment habitats worldwide, performing key functions such as nutrient cycling and sediment stability. Who knew that about nematode worms? Nice. More than you than I thought. But it is, if you haven't really thought about the role of nematode worms and nutrient cycling, you're really learning something here. So that's kind of here's an interesting fact about nematode worms, and then moving into the research. Symbiosis with microbes has been integral to the evolution of life on Earth. So this is the sweeping claim that is intriguing because you want to see how this person is going to back it up in the proposal. And he does back it up, and this proposal got funded. You could easily see this as, if you've ever taught writing or wrote stuff in high school, kids tend to start with, since the beginning of history. There's a little bit of an element of that to this. But I, as a layperson, had not, this was a newish thought to me, that the symbiosis with microbes is integral to evolution. I understand symbiosis with microbes, but I haven't thought about it in terms of, evolution from, for millions and billions of years. So the background, so I think we I guess the key point here is you want to provide exactly the right amount of information, and this is where all your readers can help you with this. Because the lay readers are probably going to ask for more background. The subject matter experts won't need all the background, so they'll just sort of be guessing, like you would be, at what people know and don't know. And again, you're also thinking about your audience. Okay, gap in knowledge, that's pretty clear. The critical need, so one element here is sometimes it's appropriate, a couple of things actually. So it's important to address the consequences of failing to meet the need. That's especially true in proposals that have a time element to them, because another element of critical need is immediacy, or the urgency of addressing a problem. If there's for example, with COVID research, extremely urgent. We got a lot of rapid NSF proposals funded doing various research on COVID during COVID. And so if timeliness is a factor. Been working on a lot of proposals involving farming and the sort of crisis that farming is facing. So we always tried to emphasize, how important it was to address the problem now rather than waiting. Same thing with, for example, flooding disasters. Objectives are pretty clear. The long-term goal. So this is especially true of career proposals. But also, in general, placing your proposal in the wider context of what your lab's goals are, but then also sort of where the field is moving. And this is a chance to make the reviewers feel important, and this is where you can convey excitement. Like, this is going to contribute to these long-term goals. Everyone wants to feel good about the work they're doing, so that includes reviewers. So that if they see that your proposal is funded, and then they see an article in the general press about the science that you've done, that's pretty fulfilling, just for them to be able to say, hey, I helped make the decision that funded that proposal. So that is something you can think about when you're thinking about how to frame that. And conveying excitement is tricky because you don't want to sound like you're sort of doing a rah-rah rooting for yourself type thing. But you can convey excitement with the careful use of language. The rationale is extremely important. So you're doing this. Why are you doing it? Why do you think it's going to lead to those outcomes? Have you considered alternate methods, and why did you or alternate approaches, and why did you reject them? And being able to link each activity, not just in the summary or specific aims page, but throughout the proposal, to keep reminding them of why you're doing things is very important. And being succinct and plausible is your goal in this 1 or 2 sentences that you'll have for a rationale. You have room to elaborate on the research strategy. Nobody expects you to prove, that your research. Nobody's evaluating you. Well, I say that. Your proposal will not be evaluated solely on the basis of your specific aims page. However, if you are submitting to NIH, you should know that only 3 people will have read your proposal, and everyone else will be frantically skimming the specific aims page as they're talking about the proposal. So it does need to be, you need to be able to, be pretty clear in the just the specific aims page, because all of those people have an equal vote in where to rank your proposal. We'll skip hypothesis and aims and research questions for now. Capacity and qualifications. These are, again, will be things that are demonstrated by your biosketch, by your facilities. When you're doing facilities and other resources, keep in mind that there's other stuff than just physical facilities. There's intellectual environment, which we have, in Trump, which we have in a very good suit. Experience to personnel, institutional track record, and then intellectual resources, as mentioned. And making sure that it's clear that you will have the time to carry out the project. That's the other important element. And sometimes that's represented by how salary you're requesting in the budget. Sometimes when you're a faculty member, you'll have a certain percentage of time to spend on research. So this would fit into that. Outcomes and deliverables can be just the contribution to science, but it could also be, if there are sometimes tangible deliverables. And it might be a database, it might be tech commercialization or patents or licensing. It might be material, if you're doing more social science research, material for policymakers that can help them make better public policy. This helps sponsors justify the expenditure of funds, so that they can point to something and say they're not just doing this for fun, these are the outcomes. That's going to make make your project more fundable. Innovation, this is pretty clear. Most grant proposals are funding leaps forward and not incremental progress. So that is a key, the key thing to make sure is that your research would represent a significant advance in the field. And then impact, again, this is going to be different depending on the agency, but I like to think about it as your chance to write a little science fiction. How will this research potentially change the world 20 years from now? And depending on the field, that's going to vary a lot. But you can look far into the future and then sort of work your way back into the more immediate outcomes of your research. But that's, again, a place where you can excite the reviewers to think about the impact this could potentially have. All right. That's not so bad. It's 102. So questions about that? Yes.
On the innovations part, should you also talk about sort of some of the innovations that the lab has that can benefit this proposal, and not just what the outcome, the innovative outcome?
Yeah, absolutely. And that wouldn't be so much innovation of the proposal itself, but kind of showing the capacity that you have. That would sort of be part of capacity. If there's preliminary data that has, most proposals will require some amount of preliminary data. And if you have produced some sort of device or method in the course of research that you'll be employing, then it's really important to explain what that is. And that could be a differentiator, absolutely. And you see that a lot. And it's a matter of, obviously, partly you can cite the research that you've done, but then also not every reviewer is going to go read those articles. So you need to figure out how much you need to explain what those innovations are in the proposal and how they'll directly contribute to the success of your project. That's what I answer your question. Okay.
So first of all, thank you for explaining on what we should do when writing a grant. So I have the exact opposite question. So what are the common mistakes that people do or what we should avoid writing?
Well, I think I've touched on some of them.
Yes.
And it's going to depend partly on the agency. But really what it comes down to is not getting enough feedback from other people. I think kind of that's it. Like you can have an idea that's not good. And if you don't show it to anyone and you think it's good, you're just going to submit and it's not going to be good. So really having other people look at your work, I think is almost the most important thing. In terms of, I talked about the other is not writing to the solicitation or trying to submit a proposal where that Venn diagram doesn't have enough overlap, where you're trying to force a square peg into a round hole. Sometimes you can force that square peg into the round hole and get funded, and that can be bad because you have elected to offer to do something that you don't really want to do. I like to give an example of a researcher in family and consumer sciences who wrote this great proposal about marriage, because that was his field of study, and submitted it and got $7 million from the US Department of Education. And then it became this thing where he had multiple weekly giant Zoom calls with everyone who was doing these proposals. He had to go to all of these meetings, and he was really not doing so much research as kind of delivering a product to US Department of Education. That was 5 years of his research life. So it's kind of a caveat emptor situation. Be careful about what you're biting off. That wasn't really your question. So in terms of proposal writing, really not writing the solicitation is the main thing. Leaving stuff out, not looking. One thing you want to do is look at the review criteria. Every federal agency has review criteria, and think if you were reviewing this proposal, how would you do according to, for NSF's merit review criteria, or the NIH's. So not starting early enough, not leaving yourself enough time. One of the common things that happens is you will not realize that you had to do something and then be scrambling to do logistical things when you want to be working on putting the final touches on your proposal narrative. And so you have to make these sort of bad decisions. Am I going to, make sure this thing gets done so I have a decent, I'm trying to think of an example. Sometimes a proposal will have a weird document that you don't have a template for, and you have to generate it, and you put it off and kind of forget about it. Then it crops up at the last minute, and you either have to do a bad job on that or a not as good job on your narrative. So time management is also a key thing. I'll probably think of more. Okay, yes?
Write something that has not been taken up previously in your lab and there's nothing much available in literature. So not having much background to state. So does that make it more rejectable, or how to make that more interesting?
Well, you have to spend a lot more time explaining the logic of what the problem is, why you're addressing it, and why you're addressing it the way that you are. So you're going to have to give more background into the problem and spend more time, instead of being able to lay out evidence instead of being able to point to evidence, whether it's your preliminary data or literature, you have to do that work as an argument. And that makes it more difficult. And if you're really good at arguing, maybe that's okay. But you're inevitably not probably going to catch every reviewer that way. So, I'd have to know what the specific thing was. Sometimes that can indicate that the problem is not mature enough to address through grant funding, just because you won't be able to have enough to prove your capacity and feasibility. Or, like I said, sometimes it's a new enough problem that what you can rest your hat on is the novelty and the innovation. And then, so depending on, for example, if it's an R21, supposedly R21s do not require preliminary data. Everyone knows they do require preliminary data. But they are supposed to be high risk, high reward. So, if you have something that's truly innovative and there's just not a lot of, there's just not a lot of work out there that's been done on it, you can rhetorically, you can emphasize the fact that, well, no work's been done on this because it's such a new and interesting idea, and hopefully try to balance out the lack of evidence with the potential to be a leap forward in the field.
So, get a grant and you have proposed some objectives and somehow you fail to complete all of the objectives on the time. So how to give a final report to the grant, when you are just completing the grant amount?
Okay, so well, there are some different scenarios there. One would be if your objectives are related to your hypotheses and your hypotheses turned out to be false, not true, that's supposed to be an outcome of science. No one can blame you for not achieving objectives that depended on a certain outcome that didn't happen. In that case, okay, the project was technically a failure, but you've learned something. This thing I did didn't work, and that's a perfectly fine thing to report. If it's more like a matter of you're way behind for whatever reason, and you get to the end of the grant period and you're just not done, most federal agencies will give you a no-cost extension, and some of them give automatic no-cost extensions. I think NSF still does 1 year. The first year is automatic, and then you have to ask permission. Obviously, there has to be some sort of justification, but often that justification does not have to be, there was, my house was destroyed by a hurricane or whatever, or, I was in the hospital for 3 months. It doesn't have to be like something like that. It can be, we didn't manage to hire, we couldn't find a graduate student with the skills we needed, so it took us an extra 6 months to get started with this. It can be like that. So the other thing is to, usually you'll be in communication with the program officer, so talking about problems that are arising as they occur, rather than waiting to the end and hoping it all turns out all right, is going to be more satisfactory to everyone, because maybe the research needs to pivot in some way. Like if your first aim doesn't work out. So first of all, your aim should not be dependent on one another. I know you've all heard that, but also if something doesn't work out, another important part of the proposal that we didn't get into detail about, because it's not usually part of the specific aims, is what are the challenges, bottlenecks, roadblocks, and how will you overcome them? And that's a tricky thing to do. But generally, every proposal in its approach section should address alternative approaches as needed. It's kind of a hard thing to do because you don't want to put out a straw man and say, well, this is a problem, but it's easily going to be solved. You want to raise actual problems, but not problems that are so big that would make the reviewers question whether you can do it at all. So there's a balance there. But challenges do happen, and being open about what's happening with the research is going to be better than waiting till the end. Jessica.
Yes, I just want to say this as somebody who is in constant communication with my PO, constant. Faculty are terrible communicators. And I just want, if you learn nothing from your postdoc, answer your emails, be responsive to your emails, talk to your PO, because a lot of times when COVID happened, I'm a behavioralist. So we had humans that we were working with. We couldn't go into the treatment facilities anymore. So we had to talk to our PO. We had to pivot. I had a great relationship with her. And so I was able to work out with her what we could do moving forward. We didn't spend money that year because we were not doing interviews. That's why Zoom, I will say this about COVID, it's made it so much easier for us to do behavioral research. But I will tell you what Jake is saying is true. Your PO is there to help you. Please be communicative with them, because they are the people who will fight for your proposal, and they are the people who will help dig you out of a hole if something weird happens. So
yeah, you have the same goal, which is for the research to be successful at some level in some way. So it's very, very helpful to go in with that attitude, is that we're trying to accomplish the same stuff to make this science happen and work. Okay, so we have 45 minutes. There are 12 of you. Does everyone have raise your hand if you have a paper that you brought in, abstract, whatever? Does anyone not?
I don't know, but I didn't believe. Sorry, so
Okay.
I'm planning on.
All right. Let's so then we'll have 2 groups of 4 and 1 of 3. So I wanted to mention that we're not dividing people according to any sort of discipline, and that's again because what we're looking for here is we're looking to be able to identify sort of the taxonomy of the Zoom part is over.
Oh, you've already got no.
No, I'm not out of that, but we can shut it down. Bye, Zoom people. Thanks for coming.
It's a divider rachel.
What's that?